fuels and how much, because my research and the research of others has proved that the Paris Agreement only constrains emissions and not the production of fossil fuels. So that's what I'm working on these days. So I'm happy to talk about climate change or conservation, old growth, all of those issues, if I can be of use to you in how you think about talking to your students. That would be great. I have done a lot of work in the last while studying climate communications and climate psychology to understand how to talk about these issues, so I can also talk about that. Okay, so the questions. You had asked me, can we start with the basics? Is civil disobedience aligned with an educator's role? So I think I'd like to approach that question really historically. What's true and a fact is that civil disobedience has played a critical role in major political social change, in every major political social change moment throughout history. So whether you're looking at decolonization efforts and rights efforts around the world in many countries, of course, the most famous are Gandhi and the salt marches, but also in India, but women's rights, women's right to vote, the end of slavery, etc. All of these major moments of social change throughout history have required some form of civil disobedience in order to raise the issues. I spent a lot of time when I was in academia trying to figure out why that was. My theory, and the theory of many others, is that when people start to take that kind of very difficult action, willing to go to jail, willing to chain themselves to things, willing to block things, especially when it's normal people that people can identify with, it shifts an issue into one that is more of a crisis situation that forces decision makers to have to respond. I often say in my speeches that there are moments in history when our politicians fail us, when governments are influenced significantly by those who stand to benefit from maintaining the status quo. And it's in those moments that it is most important for citizens to stand up in whatever way they are comfortable with. So does that mean everyone should do civil disobedience? No. Does that mean some people should, especially those of us who are in positions of privilege where we won't be treated as violently as others in jail, where we have the freedom in a country like Canada to know that if we do something like that, we don't risk our lives? Then in my opinion is yes. I've been arrested many times, and I have never regretted it because I feel like on a personal level, it's also really cathartic. It's like therapy, being able to stand up and do something with people who you know share a common purpose, and to really just say no. I don't want to be a part of the status quo. If it takes this, if the status quo, for example, is pushing pipelines through Indigenous territories, arresting elders and holding Indigenous women and their babies at gunpoint with AK-47s, like we're seeing up in northern BC with the Coastal GasLink people, then I want to be on the other side of it. I want to be these are unjust laws that are protecting these activities, and I'm going to be on the other side of it. And that is, it's a very empowering thing. And I think many people that I've met over the years who are involved in Clackwood Sound, I meet people all the time who say that experience changed my life. And I think that's what happened over the last couple of years in Fairy Creek, and continues to happen with the Save Old Growth campaign and with the Fairy Creek campaign, is that it's a hard thing to do, it's a difficult thing to do, it's a powerful thing to do, and it changes the way we interface with the world. I think it's an incredibly empowering thing to do. As a teacher, of course, it puts you in a somewhat difficult position. You know, don't you want to respect the law? Don't you want to teach the kids to respect the law? I think we do. And I have often said in my writing and even in court that I don't do this out of disrespect for the law. You know, I'm not, I said in my first trial, I'm not in contempt of this court. I think that is actually a wrongful charge. I'm contemptuous of the logging practices of, at the time, McMillan, Bloedel, and Clackwood Sound. I'm contemptuous of a government that continues to allow this kind of logging to happen, even when we know the evidence, the scientific evidence, the etc., on what should be happening, but I'm not in contempt of the court. It takes time for our laws and our legal system to catch up to science and social norms and social change. And often civil disobedience has played a role in actually resulting in new laws and shifting laws. And so if you decide to make a very difficult and personal stand that puts you in a position of being arrested, doing civil disobedience, that doesn't mean that you're in contempt of the existing laws. It means that those laws are being used to protect unjust activities. And laws and justice, there's a time lag sometimes between the laws that we currently have and justice that is necessary. I can't remember who is it that said justice is made by those who stand up, but it's a quote that I use sometimes when I'm talking about civil disobedience. Okay, so that's a general rant in my jet-lagged state on civil disobedience. Okay, wait. Considering how little the government has changed its logging practices, is this the time to begin reconsidering civil disobedience and educators' role as public servant? I think an educator's role as public servant doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't be doing civil disobedience. I mean, I know I've been arrested with a lot of teachers in the past. And you have to take your role really seriously. You have to be willing to defend it. And that can sometimes mean that it gets you in trouble. I remember in 1993, I was arrested and charged with 857 counts of criminal aiding and abetting. And a number of people filed, I don't remember what the term was, filed motions with the dean, petitioned the dean to ensure that I didn't get a degree from the Master's of Environmental Studies program at York that I was a part of at the time. And it became a really big deal with professors coming out on either side and lobbying the dean about whether or not I should be kicked out of the program because I was bringing the program into disrepute. And so I can understand as a teacher, if you'd be worried about your own position and also how the children see it, etc. But I actually found that process really important to validate the role of civil disobedience in making change. And there's lots of history and stats and facts about that. It gave me an opportunity to discuss what was happening in Canada in our logging, in our policies around logging, etc., and at the same time to put it within a frame of history and social justice, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, etc. Anyways, I won, by the way. I won the lawsuit. They didn't kick me out, and I also won the court case based on a Charter of Rights and Freedoms argument. And I didn't end up going to jail for 6 years, which is awesome because that would have really sucked. Okay, people. And so I think part of what keeps me going all the time is that, like, I love seeing the change, and I love engaging with people who I have a shorthand with. They're also feeling climate anxiety. They're also feeling climate despair, or they also love old growth forests and they know the science, or whatever it is. I have a sense of common purpose with them. I loved that about Fairy Creek. I'd forgotten that feeling about arriving in a place and there's all these people who are so different from each other, teachers and construction workers, and I met a physicist and I met an artist, all different ages, all different walks of life. Yet we all were there and immediately working together because, whatever we were doing, cooking, washing dishes, building a trail, going here, deciding who goes where, whatever, because we had this sense of common purpose. And that is that's a beautiful thing. It's an instant community. And so having a sense of common purpose and engaging in activism can really relieve their despair, especially if they can see change. But so that's our job, is to help them figure out how to define the objective of what they're doing so they can see change. Yes, I think getting kids involved in some form of advocacy, especially if you have a clear objective and a plan, can help with the despair. that's a big one. The last question I have that was emailed to me was, how have the protests changed since 92, 93? And what can we as educators learn from your experience? What can students learn from the Clayoquot Sound blockades? Okay, well, that's big. You know what's funny is what I felt in Fair Creek was in some ways that it was so much the same. In that, when you really get down to it, when you're going to a protest or when you're going to a blockade, it is about people connecting together, making strategy together in real time, supporting each other, the sense of common purpose. You know, it was very, very familiar to me. I felt like I'd gone through the, Alice through the looking glass, and it was 30 years. 30 years had never passed, and there we were again, which was also depressing, but also not good. But the one thing that really has changed, which I find really works in a lot of my speeches when I'm talking to youth, is that we organized in Clayoquot Sound at the time the largest civil disobedience in history, a national and then international campaign. We had no internet. We had no cell phones. We organized by fax machine. I'll never forget getting my first cell phone, which was in 1994. I got a job with Greenpeace and they bought me a cell phone. It was the size of a brick and it required its own briefcase. Like that was exciting. I can remember all of us and the Friends of Clayoquot Sound office in 1993 crouching around a computer to try this thing where it was a bulletin board and we could send a question to someone in Australia and they sent an answer back. And we were so freaked out. And I said to them, I often say to the kids when I'm doing these speeches in schools or whatever, now you have the world at your fingertips. Good organizing back then was how many people can we get around our kitchen table? How many fax numbers do we have we can send to other groups? How many people can you call and talk to in a day? Now you're connected to tens of thousands of people in seconds. So that means you're safer. It means you can get information quicker. It means you can have, this massive influence. It also means there's a lot more noise out there now. And so that, that does make it also a little more difficult. Other changes I would say is the world has changed in terms of its response to these issues. Like I would literally get, well, you've seen one tree, you've seen them all responses, or criticism about what a bleeding heart we were and how, who really cared. We've got so much forest, or climate change is a hoax, and, all of these just dismissed and ridiculed. That doesn't happen today. It hasn't happened really for, 10 years. I mean, I guess that's not true given Trump. Okay, that rarely happens in Canada. And it certainly is true that government and corporate decision makers now all have environmental sustainability offices. They have people whose job it is to ensure environmental sustainability and human rights. That didn't exist before. Like if we were successful in getting the attention of decision makers decades ago, then we were sent to talk to someone in the PR department because there wasn't environmental specialists at the time. The other big change I would say is on Indigenous rights. There is a lot more recognition now and respect for the need for Indigenous rights. I would argue that it's not actually resulting yet in significant legislative or financial change. But at the same time, governments and corporations know that they have to now. And I would say Indigenous communities have been more empowered and we have more leadership from Indigenous leaders on the forefront of many environmental conflicts now.
Why? Well, we don't really know why, but how can we explain the reason why the BC government today is willing to sacrifice our old growth forests, regardless of what the number is? So if you could just take that one on for a bit.
That's complicated. I'm going to go, I guess, first of all, to the forest industry question first. Why is our industry structured like this? Why are they still logging it? And then to the politics and the government. So first of all, as someone said, why are they logging old growth? northern climates have a very long growth cycle. So really, it's when we plant a tree, you're looking at really 60 to 80 years before that tree can be harvested again. So our lifetimes, really. Um, Depending on the species, and we have some faster growing species now, but that's generally true. Whereas in southern countries, the tree plantations, it's 10 years and you can be harvesting again. We don't have that in northern climates. And so there is second growth logging now, but not very much. And our logging in Canada has really been designed on a kind of volume and not a values basis. So one of the interesting recommendations that came out in the old growth science panel's recommendations, 14 recommendations came out 2 years ago from the old growth panel that the government set up. Maybe that was a year ago. I don't know. Time is fungible during COVID, I think. But the old growth panel recommended that the government start exploring and start moving from a volume-based model to a value-based model. So what does that mean? Volume means that the model of the industrial harvesting in British Columbia, and in fact across Canada, has been get out as much as you can and export it and sell it as whole as possible, basically. So it's a quick volume model, and that means that per tree cut, we get less jobs than almost any other jurisdiction in the world. We're selling whole trees or lumber rather than selling guitars and finished wood products. And so if you have a value-based model, you're literally looking more at what kind of trees are you logging, what are they most useful for, how do you create the most value from that resource, how the most jobs from that resource, how do you support through tax structures and incentives the secondary and tertiary manufacturing along the supply chain. We haven't done that. That has never been a goal of governments, and certainly not of the industry. The industry has been set up to kind of cut and run, get it out as quickly as possible. And old growth is worth a lot of money. So we log old growth in part because it's literally more carbon, more biomass per hectare, especially in a temperate rainforest, than any other ecosystem on Earth. So you just literally have more wood. And we also log old growth because the second growth is not available yet in a lot of places, and it's a lot of board feet. I mean, and it's worth a lot. I mean, one Sitka spruce tree can be worth $50,000 for one tree, so that's worth a lot of money. Unfortunately, we also log some of the biggest giants just because they're in the way. So there's lots of times when I've been in cut blocks where I've seen 800,000-year-old cedars that when they come down, they shatter because they're often hollow on the inside, and so then they're just wood waste, which is devastating to think of, considering most of those cedars are also the habitat for hundreds of plants. Like, cedars are so fascinating. It was what really moved me to get arrested in Fairy Creek, in large part because I had never seen cedars like that. It's still astounding to me that those cedars on Vancouver Island, so close to Victoria, and someone like me who has worked on forests and forestry for decades didn't even know they were there. And it's in part because just Canada is so darn big. But it's, I don't really understand it. I mean, that should be a government inventory project. We should know where it is. And as a result of the growth of the movement over the last couple of years and the demands from civil society, government is being forced to have better data, which gets to the other part of the question of government says this, other people say this, it's so difficult. It's all in the definitions of old growth. There's actually a really great article that just came out. I can't remember actually now where it came out from, but it just came out recently, and I'll get it while we're talking, but it was old growth by the numbers, and it was really good. It used a lot of the good numbers. We know we have the numbers now because of the technical panel that followed the science panel. We know exactly how much old growth is out there. We know where it is. We know how much has been deferred. And the initially the government was using a very loose definition of old growth that included a lot of bog and scrub and etc. And therefore they could say we've already protected so much of it. Now, as a result of the old growth science panel and the technical panel, there are better shared definitions of high productivity at risk old growth. That's the stuff we're worried about, the high productivity at risk old growth. And now we can identify exactly how much of that is existing and how much is protected, etc. The majority, what you need to know is that the majority of it is unprotected. Even the areas the government has deferred, we're now finding are being logged. And we don't have any permanent protection for the at-risk old growth, other than the big areas that have been permanently protected that you've heard about in the past. But anything, and the majority of the remaining old growth in this province remains at risk, even though the science panel recommended that it be immediately deferred and then protected, and even though the government committed to that. They've been hiding behind a bunch of bad numbers and a bunch of bad process that puts the onus on First Nations governments in a way that I think is actually quite reprehensible, but that's another issue. You can get flooded with information about the issues, and most of the time the climate psychology and communications research is showing us that makes people turn away from the issue. Hard thing to tell educators, but actually the statistics show us that more and more education on an issue makes people act less. So we need a foundation of knowledge, but what people need is to be motivated. So what motivates people? What motivates people is the potential for change, is a good experience working with other people that they have community with. We are motivated by other people and their successes. We're motivated by the potential to make change. So students today, they need to see examples of successful campaigns. They need to see examples of decision makers changing. They need to know that it's worth their time. And so I often, will pull out where I see something successful happening and say, how do you think that happened? We didn't just all of a sudden get equality and rights to gay marriage. No, that happened because this and this and this people, it happened because thousands of people tried a whole bunch of things to get the attention of decision makers, to push them so that they couldn't ignore it anymore. Because we have to help them understand that whatever they decide that their piece is, then that's the piece that they should do.
It's multi-layered. I've just added the link for the conditional pledge, so that what we're trying to do with Save Old Growth is, if we can get, which we're very close to now, but if we can get 100 people to pledge that they will block the part of the highway, and then basically together, right? So it's about being together in a community that will support and help each other. And essentially then, if people sign the conditional pledge, then they're promising to each other that they will be accountable to each other.
I love that pledge. I think that's brilliant.
Yeah.
And it's also the metrics, 100 people, 3 weeks, it's very tangible. This is what we're trying to do together. And this is how we build it. That's what the grunt work of social change is organizing. It's building, right? It's the 10 people to 100 people. It's 1,000 people that, and that's when decision makers can't ignore you. And it's also the persistence. People often think that, well, we did a rally. Yeah. You're gonna probably need to do 50 more. Like you can't, it takes time to shift the status quo. And so it's not one event, it's actually building that persistence and resilience is the word I was looking for.
Think, one of the things that drew me personally to save old growth was, you know, as you said, Tzeporah, there's the need for research, and then there's, you know, we need to build as a community of organizers, educators, activists, all of us. But I think for me, the sort of tipping point where I said, okay, for this issue, we really need civil disobedience was at Ferry Creek, right? Because, and also knowing that I think it was the latest information was 91% of youth in BC are for stopping old growth logging. I mean, I don't think, you know, we could get 91% of people to agree on anything, right? So it seemed like, okay, the electorate is in agreement, yet our government officials are not acting. And so I think, you know, there's that kind of laddering where you get the information, and then at a certain point when you know that the majority of the population is for this, where do you go from there, right? That's where the signing of the petitions and marching, you know, that we've done that for this. So where do we take it to the next level? But I just want to give Zane, who's here to say hello. Just want to let him
should I come
say, yeah.
Hi, Zane.
Hey, yeah, so I was asked to speak a little bit about the campaign. Yeah, so before I say that, I've been sort of, I'm one of the people who started Save Old Growth. And yeah, I've been sort of doing this only for 2 years. And during that process, I've been arrested 10 times, and I've recently spent some time in prison for breaking the Trans Mountain injunction. But I'll just briefly talk about what our logic is in terms of what we're starting to do on the 13th of June. Because in case people didn't know, starting on the 13th of June, we plan on disrupting key facilities and highways throughout BC, especially in Vancouver and in Victoria. And it's going to create a massive political crisis for the government. And one of the reasons why we're trying to do this is that recently I was on a call, and some of you may know this climate scientist, Peter Kalmus, and he said that over the past 30 years, carbon emissions have gone up by 100%. So that's a very sort of terrible stat. And I think what we're trying to do here is that we are recognizing the fact that the provincial government can't really afford to have the highways be shut down consistently for 2-3 weeks. And especially if people are getting arrested again and again, day after day, it creates a massive political crisis for the government. And people will be doing that day after day, and it's going to grow because we'll be having daily trainings at Jonathan Rogers Park, and those are going to be open to the general public. And so what we're mainly doing is that we're having our last General Assembly on the 11th, which would be at Holy Cross Church. So people will be emailed details for that. And over there, people can sign up for roles. There's going to be a nonviolent direct action training. And that's basically what's going to prepare people for the final sort of push to bring about legislative change. And, you know, obviously there's no guarantee that it's going to work. But what we know is that historically people only win when they stop caring about necessarily being successful, but when people start caring about doing the right thing and doing whatever it non-violently takes to actually win on it. And just to give some more context, we recently spoke to someone who is a good friend of ours, and she's one of the coordinators for the BC and Yukon region for the National Farmers Union. And she's going to make a public statement for us saying that basically over the next 15, 20, 25 years, it's going to be more or less impossible to grow food properly in British Columbia. And what that means is this means mass starvation at a scale we've never seen before, because that's going to be happening across the world in many parts of the world. BC will be one of the better places, people. And so what we need to recognize is that because of that sort of universal extreme emergency, our only option left is to engage in civil resistance, which means that people will quite likely risk arrest, and they will get arrested. And it's not as difficult as it sounds. And a lot of people will be doing that from different backgrounds in June, starting on the 13th of June. So if people want to get more briefed on that, then the place to come to is Holy Cross Church on Saturday, where we'll have a legal briefing and people will be trained in what it actually looks like being on the road. And so we'll enter in the details in the chat. But yeah, that's the main stuff. And
Victoria and I will have.
oh, right. And yeah, sorry. If someone is in Victoria right now, there's going to be the General Assembly at 1 p.m. at St. Anne's Academy. So the same thing will be happening there again on Saturday. The Nanaimo one, I think, is at someone's house. So we'll send you the details separately if you're in Nanaimo. But yeah, that's basically it. And yeah, thanks.
We face the biggest disruptions that could ever happen in our society, and people are already experiencing it. I mean, we all experienced it during the heat dome. You know, there were, and now, you know, people all over the world are experiencing for extended periods of time at the point, and if we act now, and yes, it's going to mean some inconveniences, some disruptions in order to capture attention, but if we act now, you know, then our kids have the opportunity to be kids. Our kids have the opportunity to choose what they want to do when they're not limping from disaster to disaster. There are many places in the world now where that is no longer true. When I was at Stockholm Plus 50 recently, I was organizing with a young woman named Mitzi Janelle Tam, who's maybe 18 now. She's a climate activist from the Philippines. And she, you know, she said something that I'll never forget. She said, you know, when I went to school, they told us about melting icebergs and polar bears. They didn't tell us what it was going to feel like to fear drowning in your own bedroom. She's had to relocate 3 times in her young life because her community has been flooded. She literally has been flooded in her bedroom and had to climb onto the roof of her house. And that kind of thing is, you know, you don't wish on any child, and that is already happening around the world. It couldn't be more urgent. And so, you know, I loved when Extinction Rebellion first started and those posters started showing up that said, sorry for the disruption on the bridge, but it's less disrupting than drought. I was I took pictures of them. I stopped right in that track. I was like, finally, someone who gets it. I think it's I see the strategy building from Extinction Rebellion to what's the new one? Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil, and the Save Old Growth strategy is kind of within the same vein. And I think it's fantastic. And I also think it's fantastic if educators get involved in this, because if the students see that someone they respect, like their teacher, is willing to do this, then they see how serious it is as well. And, you know, and they're willing to get involved. I've been so frustrated because, I mean, I helped elect Premier Horgan and the NDP in this last round of election by endorsing their climate plan. And it is there's some great aspects of the climate plan. I think what they're doing in electric vehicles is good. I think there's a lot of good aspects of it. But it is a fallacy to think that and hypocrisy to think that we can have a climate plan while expanding the production of fracking and LNG. You can't expand fossil fuels and say you have a climate plan. Like you're not in a transition if you continue to grow the problem. And so critical. I think part of what's fueling the Save the Old Growth movement is there's a core of people, and they meet and they talk about it and they create ideas, and then they create a community of practice which empowers them. And then, you know, that's the basis of any good organizing. And doing that so that you can engage more people who are part of the union. You know, conversation circles for teachers like this one. Repeat this a whole bunch of times and find out ways that you can engage people talking to each other about these issues and organizing together on a shared goal.
Violette, I would also just like to chime in here that actually the moment that the BCTF came out with that announcement, it became so much easier for us in FIPSE, the Federation of Post-Secondary Educators, to pass a motion that our union would be sending Katrine Conroy and John Horgan a letter demanding the end to old growth logging. I think honestly, if the BCTF didn't do that. I can't say that it wouldn't have passed, but it definitely helped us create that change. So that's exactly it. We need to have this collaboration between activist groups as well. And as Kim mentions, yes, we did pass that at FIPSI just last month. So that was an incredible win as well.
Social change isn't linear. It doesn't happen. It happens at tipping point moments. And those tipping point moments come because of the additive impact of all of those actions, the many actions, the thousands of actions. It took us 20 years to save the Great Bear Rainforest, and there's still parts of it that are being logged. They're high grading, and et cetera, et cetera. It can take a long time, but first of all, we already have protected some critical old growth that has been deferred, that is being deferred, et cetera. Second of all, we have forced this government to rethink its entire logging system, and they have accepted the old growth panel recommendations. It will take a while for them to implement those acceptance, but they did accept them. So we already have under our belt ratcheted wins, more ratcheted wins in the old growth campaign in the last year than we actually did in the last 10, because there was a big lull where it was like, well, we protected the Great Bear Rainforest, and then therefore can just log willy-nilly and everyone thinks it's over, which was true. And also, I think, honestly, because a lot of people in the environmental community moved from working on forests to working on climate and fossil fuels. I think that's part of what happened, especially some of the big groups. The best reminder for me has been from Indigenous leaders. I remember the Grand Chief saying to me, I was like, well, we were on year 6 or whatever of the Trans Mountain campaign. We're now on year like 8 or 9 of the Trans Mountain campaign. I literally have been working on Trans Mountain for almost a decade. And we were at some meeting at year 5, and I'm like, I can't believe it. We've been at it for so long, and now they're buying it. It was right when the government we actually won. We got the investors to pull out, and then the government bought it. And I was just so depressed, and I was like sitting there at the meeting with my head in my hands, and he goes, "Oh, so you're tired, are you?" And there was just this moment where, and I realized he was just totally like poking me, and he goes, imagine how tired we are. And it was like, yeah, persistence, resilience, we have to have that. And if you need inspiration, look to the Indigenous leadership who have been trying for hundreds of years to ensure their rights are respected. And only now do we have an acknowledgement and starting to see a reconciliation process, etc. Look to the apartheid and civil rights movements in South Africa, etc. Social change does take time, but right now, every old growth tree that we save, every single tree, every ton of carbon that we save from going into the atmosphere saves lives. We're not going to win it all at once, but every action right now is critical because ecosystems are on life support, right? And carbon is accumulating in our atmosphere. Every ton, every acre protected saves lives. That's how critical a situation we're in right now. So that's what I try and tell people is everything you do, every step is additive.
So I just, again, wanted to let people know that this campaign for Save Old Growth is one of those little steps. And a lot of people said, well, why are you only asking for old growth? Why not, change the industry completely? Why not, some other greater model? But again, as you were saying, it's those little wins.
Yeah, focus.
Yeah.
And I love the focus of the Save Old Growth campaign.
Yeah.
And the strategy of additive. I think it's really quite brilliant.
And we're hoping that after this, perhaps, we will splinter into different activities, or maybe we will stay together and focus on something. But it is, we're looking at it as a step in the larger movement of trying to kind of switch people's perception. It's a mind shift, as you probably experienced way back in 92. And I think for those of us that have been involved in various ways of activism, you realize that there is that moment where you suddenly start seeing things in a new way, and it opens up your vision to the world in a much more engaged and rich way, I think.
I think so too. If there was one bit of advice I could give you before June 13th, it would be to try and get some validators, known names, academics, former judges, lawyers, teachers, to start writing now so they're ready with their op-eds when the shit hits the fire. If you do something like this, it forces a backlash. And what we really need, people listen to people that they respect and trust. And so having people ready to talk to media, to submit an op-ed, talking about why the disruption is necessary and that they stand with you. So that was a real turning point for us in Clackwood Sound. Clayton Ruby, famous criminal lawyer, wrote an op-ed in the Globe and Mail, and he said, thousands will go to these Clackwood blockades this summer, and my heart, it goes with them. These people are heroes. And to have a famous lawyer saying, go break the law, and my heart stands with you, in the Globe and Mail was huge at the time. And a lot of people who came to the blockades and who supported us later said, well, I saw that Clayton Ruby thing and I thought I should go stand with them. Yeah. And that was a real tipping point. Yeah. So who are those validators? We're always only 2 degrees away from the people that we dream up, and don't be afraid to ask them, to do that, to get ready to support you. If they can't come, can they talk to media? Can they write an op-ed? So that there are voices surrounding you and supporting you.
I hope that this has been inspiring for people. Please come and visit our website. I included it in the chat. Again, even in Save Old Growth, there are many, many roles to play. Not everyone will be in the blockades. We need so many people and support for all kinds of different things, including, I don't know if you know how to make really good cookies for the blockaders. I mean, it's amazing how I remember being at Fairy Creek and someone passing me a homemade cookie, and it was the best cookie I've ever had and probably ever will. So it's those little things that are again behind the scenes. But if anyone is also interested in joining, that is an opportunity as well to join a community that is looking at civil resistance and bringing it to the cities so that it can't be ignored. Norman, I think Fairy Creek was amazing and a success in many ways. I think it was easily ignored because it was in the forest and it didn't interrupt people's lives, but it did create an amazing movement. So we can't call it, unsuccessful. It was a success. It didn't get the logging to stop, but it was successful for many, many other reasons. And I think that's what we want to focus on.
It did get the logging to stop in some areas. I mean, there is a bunch of Fairy Creek that is deferred, which is pretty exciting. And we have to not forget that it wasn't deferred before. So it's not all of it, but it definitely is a start.
Yeah, absolutely.
With XR. And I have to say, it's actually a lot harder to watch your son get arrested than it is to get arrested. That was a hard day for me, actually. He was arrested blockading the Broad Street Bridge a couple of years ago with XR and wrote a piece in the Georgia Straight, actually, a beautiful piece about it and why he would do it. So yeah, the next generation.
Yeah. So yeah, let me just say, Tzeporah, thank you so much. And for everyone that's attended, I will just send out a thank you email with the links to everything that we've mentioned later on tonight. And again, if you have any questions, but also if you have any requests for any of the things that we talked about today, please let me know. And actually, I'll just put here my direct email just so that it doesn't get lost. All right. Thank you, Jennifer and Teresa. Everyone, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.